Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your co-MC Rach.
And I'm your co-MC Rich. Here we are at the end of the year. It's a very special episode.
This makes me uncomfortably nostalgic for very special episodes of sitcoms in the 80s and 90s.
Don't do drugs, Rach.
Don't do drugs. And the one that stuck in my head is the Punky Brewster one involving the refrigerator and CPR. So learn CPR and don't do drugs.
The hero was inside you all along, Rach. I think there's some other lessons we could learn from bygone eras.
But that said, speaking of lessons we can learn, I think now is a good opportunity to reflect on both the year in review of this very strange 2022 and also the podcast in review.
What? This sounds so self-indulgent, Rach. What are you talking about?
It's self-indulgent time on Plus One Forward, so we're going to take over our own show. Quick, run the intro to Read a Sitch.
Happily.
Read a Sitch.
So in Read a Sitch, we will talk about our gaming highlights of 2022. Rach, why don't you kick it off? Talk about 2022. What was gaming for you this year?
Gaming for me was something of an evolution. Finally, things had changed for me. Now, longtime listeners of the show would know before COVID happened, I would say it was mostly a convention/event GM. I did a lot of GMing at conventions both in the US and Canada. I would do GMing at monthly meetups. This was the first year in a long time where I decided, you know what? I haven't run a home campaign of any remarkable duration. I should change that. I remember being on a road trip and coming home from that road trip and just had that epiphany of, I should run a game.
Yeah.
I should make a life choice. And oh boy, was this a life choice. My first game of the year, my first highlight is Fellowship. And Rich, do you remember a couple years ago when we were talking about games of the year and how you really enjoyed the time you had playing SCUP? The Sword, the Crown, and the Unspeakable Power?
I do, despite it. I enjoyed it anyway.
That's Fellowship for me.
I see. It's not really the game's fault.
It's not the game's fault that I had a good time, except it's also the game's fault. Or as I wrote in the show notes, I don't regret the time we spent together, Fellowship and I, but that was increasingly happening in spite of the game itself. The game was conspiring against me. So this will go places, friends, in terms of why this is my highlight. Because it's kind of gaming related, but it's also not. It's sort of fandom related and it's sort of not. Because me, the genius, was like, I should get my fandom friends to come play PbtA with me online. Surely this is a good idea. Spoilers, it was a great idea. It was amazing and wonderful. They're all lovely people. We've told a very strange story together. And we decided, inspired by Rich, that I decided that I was going to use Fellowship to play a canonical setting, which was playing in Type Moon's Fate franchise, specifically, if anyone is invested, Fate Grand Order, with the singularities being excuses to go to a weird, slightly dystopic place and run a campaign there. We were using the Empire framework from the In Rebellion playbook.
All right.
And I would say the big highlight, the big takeaway was about learning the importance of NPCs that players gravitate towards.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I want to hear about that.
So allow me to share with you listeners the brief life and times of the NPC Harris Onford. Harris was a very minor NPC I tossed together one night when my players decided, as players often do, that it was a really good idea to split the party. And I had someone stay at the tavern that my player characters run while the others went to go find an adventure. And I went, oh no, something needs to happen. So I used a random name generator and then got Harris and then grabbed a stat block out of the Fellowship playbook and went, look, I made a character. Great. And he had the least lines of this scene. It was a very good scene because the player character had an NPC and this character decided, I'm going to be a mentor for this NPC and show them what hospitality means when the enemy shows up in your space. Amazing scene. Really set the tone for a lot of the game that happened. But, you know, I thought this Harris was kind of a joke thing. And then I brought him back once or twice in later sessions, just sort of to reincorporate that this character is a character that exists in the world, because that's a big part of Fellowship, because you can always talk to your NPCs. But this guy was kind of trashy, kind of an example of an Imperial leader that the party should not agree with, until the party decided to adopt him. And they ran a whole mission to convert him secretly to the rebellion. And this is where I would say that this character becomes an inside joke to just the party, but Harris escaped because my players decided they needed a face for Harris, you know, an actor to represent him so they could draw fan art of him. And I went to my partner and said, here's what this character is. Please help me. I have no idea. This is the worst part of gaming for me. I always struggle with getting actors or representations for characters for whatever reason. And we settled on David Bowie.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. But specifically David Bowie from this problematic film from 85 called Into the Night that I mentioned on a long, long ago Gauntlet podcast. It's a John Landis film. Look at your own peril. Please read any content warnings. So he became David Bowie. And now there's Harris fan art on Tumblr that if you know the right Tumblr feeds, you can go find this. There's very confused friends in the fandom who are not part of this group who are asking why David Bowie is hanging out with these fake characters.
That's wild.
It brings me so much joy. There are Harris memes. Oh, it's so much fun. The highlight I learned here is, well, players love fan service. Give them fan service they enjoy. If they gravitate towards an NPC, if they gravitate to a location or a theme, run with it, because that's them indicating to you, no, please show more of this to us. We like this. This is exciting us. This foolish Imperial leader they adopted and converted to the rebellion and then had interesting conversations about politics with, and then sometimes took him on misadventures. Tried to steal a car of him once. It didn't end so well.
That's awesome.
Oh, and my final note here is, I will admit it was Paul Beakley's recommendation that ended up with me playing Fellowship. We are at 20 plus sessions. It's going to end later this week of the recording we're doing here. So by the time you hear this podcast, the campaign will be over. I really do think it does better with a shorter campaign.
Interesting. Okay.
It hit its sweet spot. Again, going to lean to what your PCs gravitate towards. I would say about session 5, when they really got a flow for, oh, we can bring NPCs into the party, and then we can decide, what does it look like when we split the party and deploy people? Like, who is in the room with who, and what are their relationships like? Are these two exes, or they have the face of your ex in our case? It was really interesting. The other highlight is Urban Shadows.
Yeah.
Rich might be in this campaign.
I am biased because this campaign has been great.
Urban Shadows is my favorite urban fantasy game. I'm finally playing with Rich, which is really exciting.
Yes.
We've played together before, but I think this is our first Urban Shadows together.
It is. Yeah. First Urban Shadows together.
My highlight here has to do with my character and the design goals I set with my character and how they're playing out, because it's so much fun. I'm playing a scholar again, not specifically the same scholar I was playing when I played duet games with my partner. I actually brought back kind of like an alternate universe version of an NPC scholar from those games, with the understanding, I'm using this character idea as a template, but obviously he's going to have relationships with the other PCs and the NPCs in the city we have. And his life detoured at a different point in time. But scholars are kind of selfish people. And it's sort of a selfish starting place for me to say, here's this character who lives a little bit rent-free in my head. And I wanted to balance it out with a design goal for my Scholar Valberg.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, I decided that if during character creation we had any negatively flavored debt prompts that the other players were a little bit skeptical or uncomfortable about, I would take them. It's a party with a lot of people who either haven't role-played before or haven't role-played together.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes some of those Urban Shadow prompts can be a bit uncomfortable or imply more nefarious things about your PC. So I was like, I would raise my hand and say, sure, let's talk about how that manifested in the past, which resulted in a lot of hilarious outcomes, such as Rich's character attacking my character with a sledgehammer in character creation.
In character creation. No die rolling. No, yeah, it's already happened. Yeah,
you have 2 harm. Deal with it. Your arm's in a sling. And at the same time, I want to make a point that this is a character who will, in play, reach out to other characters. He's not, on the surface at least, intimidated or afraid, but he will be in situations as any good scholar, look at a Sitch and then pick up his cell phone and call whoever seems to be the most useful in this set of circumstances. So that means I had to spend a lot of time in between sessions thinking about how does my scholar feel about other figures in the community, and have those answers be complicated and inform debt exchanges in play. So I could say, secret reveals that Rich's character, Holly, my character, feels she's physically kind of a terrifying woman. Absolute powerhouse, but innocent in a way that it would almost feel bad to manipulate her into doing something she didn't want to do, or maybe even something she wants to do, because she almost seems programmed to do things.
Yeah.
Too sheltered for her own good in a weird way.
I love that you picked up on that and played with that. That's awesome. Your design goal has paid off in more fun for me.
It's true. It's game stories talk, but we had an incredible scene in the last game where my character sought out Holly when she might have been picking up guys at a bar to go bring to the vampire. And we had this really intense conversation. And I think you ended up gaining redemption, but boy, did it hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was great. And I love that you pushed on that, because that was something that existed from character creation to have a tie with our PC Vamp, was that she trolled the bars for people to feed to him, because that's what she felt she was programmed to do. And I love that you pushed on that and gave me an opportunity to explore it.
Rich, what have your highlights from 2022 been for gaming?
Well, let's do the numbers, as I am wont to do at the end of every year.
Metrics.
It was a year of fewer games for me. I played only 18 different PbtA games in 2022, 12 less than in 2021. So huge drop. 9 of those 18 games that I got to the table, virtual or otherwise, were new to me. So I got to try 9 new PbtA games. Most of them were Firebrand's games. That was 6 less than in 2021 when I tried 15 new games. So big drop there. However, my frequency of games played, like game sessions, was pretty solid. I played a total of 171 PbtA sessions, which was only 1 less than last year. Not bad. Not bad there. I just didn't branch out as much as I had in previous years. I'm going to talk a little bit about games that I discussed during the Gauntlet end of the year, game of the year, but more specifically PbtA-wise. So the duet game that I played with Carrie, my lovely wife, this year, for most of the year, 30, what I call sessions, although that's really like 30 weeks worth of sessions because we would play 1 to 2 times a week, was Stonetop. Now, Stonetop is, I think it's even true from the game's designer, from the bits of design notes, and I'm not a person who's very studied, so if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, Jeremy Strandberg. But my understanding is that he created Stonetop as a drift from Dungeon World. It sure slots in really, really well with the knowledge I brought over from Dungeon World, but it's a refresh, it's a new look, and it's taking the core of Dungeon World and then layering on, bolting on, building on a bunch of homestead moves, seasonal moves, larger scope moves, steading stuff. These rules really, really interested me. And we started off saying, all right, you're playing the daughter of the Dungeon World character you played to 10th level a couple of years ago, but now you've moved to this place that just magically showed up in our weird fantasy fairy kingdoms setting, and it's called Stonetop, and it's this Stone Age village. So we started off saying, hey, go here, what's going on here? Stonetop is a rule set and also a setting. And the setting itself got a cool map. It's got a bunch of built-in, here's all the problems, here's the good stuff, here's Stonetop as it lives and breathes. And it really didn't jive for my wife so much. She didn't like the small town vibe. She's playing a very fantastical creature, a literal fairy princess, like the youngest daughter of a royal line. And it just wasn't enough fantasy for her. So we quickly moved the game to the neighboring village, which was a little more fantastical. It had honeybees and a bee-themed tavern and various fanciful species or humanoids, demi-human types.
You're giving me some Jupiter Ascending vibes.
Yeah, there's some Jupiter Ascending vibes in this. No shame.
Bee smell royalty.
Yeah, bee smell royalty. I forgot that little bit. That's right. So we moved it to Honeybrook, which is literally a 5e village that I've found online and liked a lot. But we kept all of Stonetop. And even last night, we were doing the seasonal turn and talking about the population and having various projects going on. And it's bringing forth that promise of, hey, you can play on 2 different scales. You can play that moment to moment, but we can pull back, use these steading rules, the seasonal rules, and play out the setting as a living, breathing, statistically represented without too much detail thing. And it was really neat. We had no in-character moments in our hour and a half of play. It was all talking about, all right, if you want your population to have homes for the winter, then you're going to need to sacrifice this or this. And okay, here's what I'm committing of those resources. And let's roll some dice. Okay, I'm going to talk to these people. And it was a lot of strategizing, but she was so bought in because we had paid the dues of building up this setting as something she cared about that was worthy of her effort. Mm-hmm. She'd just gone on a very long caravan trip to the largest city to gather a large number of supplies to build some allies, to recruit some engineers to help build some houses. So she's bought in, and it's super fun. Like, we're really, really sucking the marrow from the bone of Stonetop's rule set. So we found that while it's called Stonetop, you don't have to play in Stonetop. And while Stonetop is built as an Iron Age, you don't have to do that. Like, she is playing a Dungeon World playbook, and she loves it because it slots in just great. So everything about the game, in other than the playbook she brought to the table, is Stonetop, and it's a very solid system. And the book isn't out, like physical book hasn't been printed and sent out yet, so the Kickstarter's still in process, but there's enough documentation, PDFs that have been released for it to be fully playable, and I'm really looking forward to having that book in my hand in 2023. So that's definitely been a highlight for me.
It's really interesting for you to share how it's working, especially in longer term play, because I found Stonetop really compelling when we had the designer on to interview on the show.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole Dungeon World 3.5, but also it leaning more in towards what's going on in town, which feels very Legacy Life Among the Ruins.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like, that was the parts of Legacy I loved.
Yeah,
I mean,
me
I
too.
enjoyed the character stuff, but I also like what's going on in your community and how does that, like, that not just being fluff, but something that mechanically informs the world as well.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be Stonetop's. The one thing I got from that is that he has created a set of rules that can exist agnostic to that particular town. I ported over a good bit of Stonetop, but Honeybrook had its own troubles. So we mechanized those. You're going to have a project to do this. And you know, there's some troubles over in these woods here. So what are you doing about that? Oh, I've got these patrols. Well, if these patrols are going full on, then you can't commit as many people to creating the houses that you need. Oh man, I'm going to have to. Yep. So it's just all of that mixing and matching of narrative and strategy that isn't normally my forte, but this game does it in just an abstractly simple enough way for it to be about discrete choices that are not micromanaging choices, if that distinction makes sense to you.
It's less about the granular elements in the setting and more about almost the lifeblood of the setting, if you want me to wax platitudes on it.
Yeah, there's some platitudes I like. So Stonetop, definitely a highlight for me in 2022. The other one, which is second in most sessions played, is Stars in the Dark. We played 29 total sessions in 2022. Andish from the Gauntlet community continued that Blades in the Dark reskin to Star Wars that he began last year. This year was cool as a highlight for me because it was all about, well, it started off, we were playing Bravos, which is a crew type all about kicking some butt and taking some names. And this was down in the bowels of Coruscant during the period of Imperial rule. And we played a little fast and loose with some of the expanded canon and some of the official just to carve out our own niche. So don't at me if you're reading Wikipedia and going, hey, it should be Coruscant, you know, security forces, not stormtroopers. We wanted some stormtroopers, so we had stormtroopers. We had an Imperial garrison, and we wanted to shoot stormtroopers, and we did that a lot. And then the heat grew to the point where the mechanics tipped over, and one person lost their character for the second half of the campaign.
Oh, wow.
Because they were incarcerated. And we looked at the heat level and the wanted level and said, wow, you're in for life. Then our headquarters was destroyed because we went head up on some really bad dudes. And it was devastating. We actually had a conversation outside of game. I think it took up almost a whole session of, okay, what do we want to do? Do we want to pivot? Do we want to skip some time and start with a brand new crew? Do we want to continue the story forward? And it was a hard choice. In the end, the decision we made was that what was left of the crew picked up, moved to a completely different level in Coruscant, because there's thousands, 5,000 levels, all subterranean, all planet-sized. Mm-hmm. So we moved from 1313 to 1314, and Undish went and created a whole new faction list.
Oh.
30 or more factions. And it wasn't a bunch of reskins of, oh, it's like this, but I've renamed it this. It wasn't. It was a completely, it felt like a whole new setting. It was a whole new world. Anyway, it was a lot more royals. There were these noble houses, some, most of them in bed with the Empire. Some of them like playing footsie with the Empire, but mostly trying to keep hold of their stuff. We retrenched and took what we had left and started building up our tier. And so the entire tone and angle of the game changed, and the mechanics fully supported us as we rose up the tier rankings and started going head to head against tier 3, tier 4 forces. But the head-to-head now worked on a different level of, instead of us going sticking our noses against a unit of stormtroopers, we had cohorts, we had strategies, we were leading things, but we weren't the only people doing things. It was a fuller crew. We were talking about using a cantina to fuel things and smuggling goods back and forth between 13 and 13-14 because we had those established relationships. So sorry, it's a little bit of this is like gamer story, but the mechanics itself were super interesting because it allowed us to approach the game differently. And similar to what I talked about in Stone Top, Blades is absolutely built for scale changes. And Blades in the Dark, which was the whole engine, Stars in the Dark was just a gentle, loving reskin. It was always there for us, pushing us into interesting new directions, putting things on a knife's edge in very interesting ways. And my only complaint about the mechanics is that I had played my character so hard before things fell apart in 1313. She was on the doorstep of #too many traumas. And when you get 4 traumas in this game, you trauma out. You're done. You retire. Maybe you just lost it. And she was sitting at 3. And I preemptively retired the character and transitioned to a different character in the crew because I couldn't stand the thought of losing her mechanically. I would rather her realize things are just too intense and she needed to take a step back. And the mechanics told me that. It was not a story I wanted to hear, but it felt right. It felt like the right repercussion for her choices.
Do you feel there were different benefits from running this game in a reskinned Blades in the Dark versus Scum and Villainy, which is often touted as the Forged in the Dark but Star Wars game?
That's a great question because from the outset I said, there's this Scum and Villainy thing. And he laughed and he said, yes, I'm well aware that there's a Scum and Villainy game. In reskinning Blades, his goal was he wanted things tight, like physically tight. He wanted the feeling of Blades where you've got street gangs. In Scum and Villainy, you have a bit of that, but then you can hop in your ship and you just fly away. And he didn't want that as a release valve. He also really wanted to get a deeper knowledge running Blades, so I totally respect that. And the reskin to Star Wars allowed me to avoid, not have to deal with the crew types and the job types of Blades that I find personally not my cup of tea. Like assassins and cultists are not the kind of folks that I want to play in my happy, fun elf games, personally.
But Sith cultists.
No, killing Sith cultists sounds great. In fact, we did a bit of that. It was hard. But I hear you. That said, Scum and Villainy has a very different feeling. The factions are looser, more spread out, dotted across a star system, a galaxy, across multiple planets. Whereas Blades it's the guys who are in the next block. And unexpected consequences can spill over to multiple different factions. You can chance run into people in ways that you could more easily avoid in Scum and Villainy. Now, you and I, we had a great game of Scum and Villainy.
Oh, I love Scum and Villainy.
I think it's a great game.
Yeah, I think it's a great game too. I'm not dismissing it. But as you're describing that idea of space, like not just the space as a setting, but how tight situations can be physically and metaphorically, I was just thinking in my head about, well, how often did we bump into the different factions? That was mostly circumstance. Like you go to a planet and it turns out there's this other faction here. Or if you're on the space station and you accidentally cross paths with somebody, but it's not like you're stuck in these same neighborhoods in a city and you have to watch your back because you know this person of this rival faction always takes a specific route home and it crosses over with yours every single day. That doesn't happen in Scum and Villainy.
No, it wouldn't. And things like, oh, as a GM, your failed roll means that people were eavesdropping on this line because everyone uses this as their secure line to talk to so-and-so out of 1313 area contact nodule because the comms are all borked here. So you have to go here. And these guys have heard this, and that's the dirt they have on you now. You couldn't really do that as easily in Scum and Villainy. It would feel less plausible. The last highlight is a odd highlight, but when I retired Edema, one of my favorite characters that I've played the last 5 or so years, I brought in a brand new character. That was at a point when it was a tier 3 group and everybody else was like, imagine bringing in your first level fighter when everybody's about 8th level. And I haven't had that feeling, Rach, in good 20 years or more, probably longer, of being the first level fighter trying to keep up with the 8th or 9th level folks. It was rough.
Remind me, is this the first time you've retired a PbtA / Forged in the Dark character, now that I think about it more?
I think it is. I think it's the first time that I have retired a character that saw a significant amount of play and continued playing in the game with a new character. I can't think of any other instance in PbtA or Forged where I have done that. Yeah.
This feels like the perfect opportunity for a topic episode that will not happen.
Oh, spoilers. The last highlight, and I realize we're going a bit long, so I'll speak about it more briefly. But I got a feeling this year, like one of my highlights was the feeling of having reached a point of fluency with Powered by the Apocalypse. Not a brag.
Humble brag.
I don't feel like I'm bragging. I feel happy that I reached this point that I know many other people reach sooner than me. So that's why I don't think of it as bragging. But this is the year where I came into it with Bounty of the Week, my Monster of the Week reskinned for Mandalorian-style bounty hunting in Star Wars. I also kit bashed together X-Crawl World, which is this loving reskin of a game that Jen Kitzman, ex-guest host of ours, and also X-Crawl, this third-party D&D supplement, and Worldwide Wrestling, and just kind of slammed those all together with another Jeremy Strandberg joint of Homebrew World. And it's a really fun, tight little system that does exactly what I always imagined X-Crawl could be fun doing. And then my 17-year-old son says, I want to run a game set in Genshin Impact, the video game MMO. And we hashed out over the course of like 3 walks outside for an hour or so a World of Genshin Impact, a Wodu game. And then I had this idea after watching Stargirl, a great show, really love it, of something inspired by Stargirl meets Breaking Bad meets Hulu Runaways show and a few other parents who are doing bad crimes but actually genuinely love their kids and want them to do well. That weird juxtaposition of drives for bad parents. And I just kind of mashed together masks with Cartel and created 7 playbooks in the space of a week. None of it's like new design. This is literally mashup stuff. But I'm able to do it with a confidence level that I understand the underpinnings, the holding spaces, the engines, the economies of these, to be able to mix it together in a pretty satisfying way. Like, I'm itching to run this game, even though I don't really have time. The holidays are creeping up on us, and I still got to edit this podcast when we finish recording it.
The
all
great
this other
disruptor
stuff.
of podcasting games.
Oh, holidays. But that fluency in hacking PbtA, that feeling of comfort that I've finally reached is really gratifying. I have had a lot of fun pulling together things. A lot of my lonely fun was creating character keepers. And now my lonely fun is creating character keepers for the kit bash games that I've thrown together using 4 different PbtA games to do this other thing. And it's been pretty cool. It's definitely a highlight for 2022 for me.
Open your brain.
In Open Your Brain, Rich, you and I both have 5 minutes or so each. What specific issue of play, journal of play, or observations of stuff that happened in or on the show do you want to talk about it now that we have the chance to do it? Now that I read that out loud, it feels more like we made this read a Sitch, but for us. Oh my gosh, we finally get to talk about what we want to talk about on Read a Sitch. I'm so excited.
Do it.
Okay, this is a tangent. The most self-indulgent thing I ever want to do in this podcast and will not do because it's a terrible idea was to do another movie night episode, which is an episode format we played with a couple years ago, where we sat and looked at a piece of media and discussed it in the framework of Powered by the Apocalypse game. But in my mind, it was always Monster of the Week, and I used that as a framework to talk through my favorite Fate storyline. But the original version of that storyline is buried in a larger serial fiction video game. So I thought, well, maybe the comic book adaptation, because in some regards that's a better version of the story. And then I swear 2 weeks ago, the author of the comic book adaptation came out and went, hey guys, this adaptation is running much longer than any of us anticipated. It's going to go until at least 2024.
Wow.
At least. Which means like there's no way for me to go to Rich and be like, can you please somehow read this thing so I can talk about it? So yeah, very inaccessible. Will never happen. Although I did at one point, I will admit, wrote little 4-panel comics with various characters from the storyline playing Monster of the Week, making fun of Monster of the Week mechanics. That I at one point intended to draw and never did. They just live in my Google Drive forever. So now that I've gotten that off my chest, my deep dark secrets about my PbtA zine that is not to be because it's for an audience of just me, let's talk about my favorite table culture self-indulgent topic again, which I may have mentioned years ago, but I'll bring it up again. And I have named this concept, get in the car, we're going to find the plot.
I love this.
A long time ago, I think this came up on the show, and there was an incident at a Powered by the Apocalypse convention game. The MC was running a specific game that I will not mention because I don't want to make fun of the game or the game designer, and I don't want the GM to figure out I'm talking about them, just in case they're listening. But let's just say it was not a great game in the scope of the table. And the MC was very focused on one specific character and ignored the rest of us, including this man who was sitting beside me, and I think this was his first PbtA game ever. He was a little bit more reserved. He was playing a character that was tiny bit more trad. It was a 1930s setting. I think he was playing a high school football coach, which might hint at the setting of this game. But yeah, so I felt really bad for this guy, and that the MC talked past them a lot. And at one point, after about 3 hours of this nonsense of a 4-hour game, I had had enough. There had been all this taunting and teasing. Oh, there's a plot just beyond the hill. You keep getting phone calls from your dead friend, Rach's character. And I was like, all right, it says on my character sheet I have a car. I'm going to get into said car. Where do you two live? This was my partner and this poor new player. Okay, I'm going to go pick you up, and we are going to drive towards the mystery, come hell or high water. The GM was slightly bemused that we were running towards the danger. He even commented to one of his friends who came and hung out at the table on break saying, look at these suckers, they're running towards the danger. He was willing to play along with it, and we had a fantastic hour of play. We burned down a house. We almost died. It was great. And this other player reached out to me after saying, thank you so much for engaging me, because I wondered if I had wasted my slot. Like, I was at a gaming convention. I wanted to have a good time, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't have a good time. The lesson to take away from this, we talk a lot in PbtA about the MC being a fan of the characters. But if you're a player, what does that mean? That principle, be a fan of the characters. How can a player support that principle or even explore it in their own way? I was sharing a little bit earlier, I'm building Valberg, my scholar, for Urban Shadows. How do I make him entertaining to the other players, but also, I'm Rach, a fan of the other characters. I want to see more of Holly and Leora, Aaron and Hepzibah. How do I angle for that? How do I engage with that? And I can't speak for all players, but when I'm in character, I really love it when other PCs will engage with me in character. We can sit and have ridiculous conversations and see if that inspires us to action or, to pick up everyone in your car and go for a drive. And I make it a point to engage others and make PC to PC interaction one of the important things for me at the table.
Really jive with that kind of play style. And it isn't unique to PbtA games, but PbtA games have that be a fan of the characters, and you angling that as being a fan of the other characters is wonderful. That's the whole ethos behind my staunch I love character keepers for online play, where all of the character sheets are on one tab and everyone can see everybody else's bits and mechanical goodies, because now I can play towards the move that you're really good at. I can set up the conflict that I see you have noted. If everybody has a different tab on the character keeper that is their own sheet and it apes the way that things happen at the table, I think you miss that opportunity. It's less easy to be able to engage mechanically or see what somebody's written down as the cool thing that they're interested in.
I like spying on other people's moves. You're not wrong.
It's really good. Is there anything more in your 5 minutes?
That was everything I felt if I were to do a Read a Sitch segment, I would share.
5 minutes is not a whole 5 minutes, maybe, but maybe it ends up there. Doesn't feel like it is. I find the Power by the Apocalypse, landscape of games interesting in that, let's go on a trip here, Rach.
Okay. I packed my bags.
All right. To me, sometimes when I look at PbtA and all of the games that make up the PbtA landscape, it feels like the inverse of the Dungeons and Dragons landscape. In that, in the D&D-verse, all games lead back to D&D in the public sphere. In order to introduce the concept of role-playing games to normies, you often have to say, like this cool podcast I used to listen to, it's like D&D. Everything's about D&D. But the most popular PbtA games in the circles that I have traveled aren't the original Apocalypse World. For the last 10 plus years, Apocalypse World hasn't been the game that people all go back to. In fact, one of the reasons why I ask the gateway question on this very podcast, where every designer, we ask them, what was your gateway? What's the game that got you into the Power by the Apocalypse sphere? I wasn't trying to cred check anybody. I really was curious. It was an informal survey of what game got you here? Tell me if I'm wrong, Rach, because this is, of course, a very informal, non-scientific survey, but it sure didn't feel like Apocalypse World was most people's gateway.
No, so based on my informal observation, so what was your gateway, out of curiosity, before I go on my thoughts?
Again, not cred checking. It was totally Apocalypse World.
Yeah, same with me. It was totally Apocalypse World, and I can tell you exactly where and exactly when, and if I had 5 minutes with a Google search, the exact date and possibly
Wow.
time I played Apocalypse World because it was at a convention.
Right. Nice.
I've seen the same thing. When I was running a Apocalypse World game at Queen City Conquest, I put it on the schedule to see who would sign up, and I got a lot of people who said, I'm curious about Apocalypse World. I've played Monster Hearts or Dungeon World, but I've never played the OG game.
Yeah, I could see that.
What are your thoughts as to why?
I don't quite understand why Apocalypse World isn't more popular, because I've found it to be incredibly flexible. It's fun. It's exciting. It's just solid. Like, all of the rules work really, really well. First edition, second edition, there are some cool improvements. Burned over the most recent version that's still available only on Patreon, and I think you can get it on Itch now. Yes, you can get it on Itch. So totally check that out. They're great. I don't know. Was it the sex moves? Did that turn people off? Was it Vincent's writing style? Sometimes I wonder that. I've heard people complain about the way that the Apocalypse World is written is as if the author doesn't like me or something. And I found that odd, but I literally heard that from multiple people. So that could be a factor. It could just be an artifact of time where Apocalypse World doesn't have the Magpie push or the licenses that Magpie pushes or the evil hat gloss that you might see on Thirsty Sword Lesbians or Apocalypse Keys. Maybe that's why that Apocalypse World came out pre-really Kickstarter being a thing. And then the next generation was a Kickstarter, but it was at an odd time. And then Burned Over is really solid, and I love it, but it hasn't really come out. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say.
So I have thoughts about it, because I too have pondered about this. Was it the writing style that Vincent used? That's the first one in our notes, so I'll start there. I think that's part of it. It's not written like a typical game book. Mm-hmm. And I believe there was, depending on how much you want to read into it, a blog post at one point many, many years ago where Vincent was talking about the way Free Market, which is a separate role-playing game, not PbtA, mm-hmm. made communities of people who were in the circle and out of the circle. And the idea of writing a role-playing game that was intimidating and hard to approach, but once you were inside, you knew the other people who were inside, and you could be like the cool crowd there. I might be paraphrasing and misremembering parts, so I'm not trying to indict Vincent here. This is just what I remember. And I wonder if that ended up leaning into the way that Apocalypse World was written. Mm-hmm. I think post-apocalyptic settings on their own are sometimes a genre that people struggle with and don't necessarily always have the same agreement about what they are. Like, if you tell people to describe a Mad Max movie, they're probably going to describe, well, now they're going to describe Fury Road, but they would have described The Road Warrior and not Mad Max. I think Mad Max is equally a dystopian apocalyptic movie, mm-hmm. but it's not quite what people imagine them to be. And it's not also necessarily a setting people gravitate towards. To bring up It's Like D&D again, it's pod faded. You probably can't find it, but many, many years ago, I had mentioned on that podcast a traditional fantasy setting does not really resonate with me in the way it resonates with many other people. And mm-hmm. this goes beyond tabletop role-playing games. I really like post-apocalyptic fiction because it mirrors in some ways the landscape I grew up in. I grew up in a city in Ontario named Hamilton, which it's a steel-making city. It's very Rust Belty. It's not as dystopian as its American counterparts, mm-hmm. but I could look out my window and see smokestacks that also spewed fire. That is what my skyline looked like as a child. So wow. The idea of making a fantastic version of that, and what does the apocalypse look like? Oh, but these are also nostalgic touchstones in certain ways. It's like a fun, happy place for me, but I totally understand why some people want to think about rolling hills and deep forests, but that isn't necessarily my nostalgic place.
That's interesting.
Also, the sex. I think the sex is a huge intimidating factor. And I say that as someone who likes the presence of sex a lot and feels that if people feel safe in those spaces, that sex should be more part of the narrative of tabletop role-playing games in the way that what doesn't have to be sex on screen, but the idea of that these characters would go and have sex with each other. What does that mean in the lead up to that moment in their relationship and the aftermath? Are they desperately clinging to each other to make some sense of the chaos around them? Is this the big fulfillment of this will they, won't they relationship? Like, I think it has a great space in storytelling, but because it's a very loaded topic to say, they're not even called sex moves in Apocalypse World. That's a Monster Hearts thing, isn't it?
That's a very good point.
They're specials.
Specials.
Yeah, like I think there's a lot of factors working against it. And my other not scientific research, I knew a lot of people that onboarded with Dungeon World because that was a very accessible version of PbtA that took out some of the more inaccessible parts of Apocalypse World. There is no sex. It goes back to the D&D tropes. I know a lot of people who used it to play dungeon crawls.
There were a lot of folks who said Dungeon World was their gateway.
Anyway, that's my hot takes.
I like it.
I like Apocalypse World. I think you can do a lot of really interesting stuff with Apocalypse World. Curtis, who's been my pet character in our Act Under Fire segments, he started as an Apocalypse World character.
Oh.
He has lived many lives since.
That is awesome. I love that you returned to this character. I'm really curious what about Curtis is unique. What story have you not told that needs to be told with that character? That's neat.
That became NaNoWriMo stuff, Rich. Don't ask.
Okay.
Not allowed in my Google Docs drive. Not allowed to go there.
Well, that was definitely 5 minutes. So, shall we move on?
Okay, get your dice out. It's time to act under fire.
It is time to act under fire.
Well, here we are in Act Under Fire, Rach, where our last fire. We've been a little coy, and I apologize for that, but this is the last recording of +1 Forward. Rach and I have had an incredible run with this podcast. We have accomplished pretty much everything we wanted to accomplish with +1 Forward. I started the show and wanted to talk to all the cool designers about their amazing, exciting games. And then I was near to doing that for the first gen of games, and Rach came on board and helped reshape the show into the much better version where we talked about design, where we talked about media and genre emulation, and we tried a bunch of cool things like the summer series and the take in advance on little short series that we did. And we even did some AP, and all of that has been really fun. But over the pandemic and then over this last year, I've started to feel like I'd accomplished the things that I wanted to in the PbtA space, that I was still enjoying getting together with you, Rach, and still enjoying the motions of the show because it was a fun habit within my leisure time. But I felt like we'd explored the pieces of PbtA I know about that interested me and stretched my boundaries a good bit too. Like, we've talked about a number of PbtA games that I didn't really think were going to be my jam. And some of them, it was right. That wasn't exactly my jam. And that's totally cool. It really is, because it turns out that some of those where I go, man, that is totally not my game. I have heard, oh, thank you for doing this episode to introduce me to this cool game that is totally my jam. And that makes me really happy. I get as much joy from that as anything, because that's solved for one of the things I really wanted to do with +1 Forward, was highlight a lot of designs, a lot of people taking chances, big swings, exciting ideas, people trying to design something new to explore spaces that don't get as much of a spotlight.
Mm-hmm.
I have really enjoyed that. And I don't think I would have had as much success if you hadn't been with me, Rach. Like, I don't think Plus One Forward would have lasted more than 2 years if you hadn't come on board and really helped to reshape the show. So I just want to take a moment here as we are saying this is the last episode to say thank you for being on the majority, the vast majority, and the best majority of Plus One Forward with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me onto the show. Early on in the show, it was a little bit awkward because I think that was actually when we got our first Any nom, and I had only been on the show for a couple of weeks, and then you dragged me out to the Ennies, which was an absolute trip. Was that 2017?
I want to say it was, yeah. 2017 feels right.
It was an Ennies where, again, to not point fingers, two well-known members of the tabletop industry would get on top of the stage and start yelling at each other. I remember looking at Twitter while this was going on and seeing people in different languages trying to explain why people were yelling at each other. And we sat at the back and we were like, and I was like, why am I here? But it's fun. It's a neat space. Awkward.
Yeah.
But I loved my time on the show, and I've loved seeing all of the really interesting spaces in terms of gaming where people are going and exploring. It was a lot of work, but I really enjoyed doing the Alphas episodes, which is when I was running around at Metatopia and interviewing game designers, usually fresh off of a playtest, and there being a lot of raw emotions and, spending 5 minutes and kind of going, well, why are you here? Not in an accusatory, why are you here? But share with me what your daydream of a game is. Why are you bringing this game here? It's really different from everything else. But what in it compels you? And I know those episodes were quite popular. I always wanted to continue, but I could never really figure out a way to have it have the same energy during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Which is also when we brought in the summer series, though.
That's true.
Where we did a focus on spin-offs of PbtA, and that, I think, opened doors to talking to whole different circles of designers who were on different platforms that we might not necessarily have been fully acquainted with. And then some of those interviews was we would interview someone, the interview would go great, and they would be like, oh yeah, I know a person. Would you like me to get you in touch with my friend? They're doing something really wild over here. I think that's how we got Revolution on the podcast, and that interview was fantastic.
Yes, absolutely.
I've loved that. I love seeing everything going on in those spaces. I love seeing the evolution of PbtA and how it's become a recognizable style of game within the what do you expect to see on Kickstarter.
It's true.
Of course, you expect to see your D20 games, but you have big licenses now attached to PbtA games, and that wasn't happening when you start the show, and also I don't think was happening when I joined.
No, I don't think so. An observation. The Alphas thing. To me, the success of the Alphas episodes is one of the reasons I am so happy you became part of this show, that this is our show. Because before that period, I even said this to designers, is this game has to be, when it's on this episode, someone needs to be able to listen to this episode and go and put their hands on, physically or virtually, a copy of this game. I'm not here to sell your vaporware, game designer. It's got to be a done game. And I've felt pretty strongly about that because I've listened to podcasts where somebody's talking about some cool game and then it just never happens. And you wanted to go to Metatopia and do these alphas things, and I had reservations. I'm like, well, I got a whole reason. And
Rach, don't you remember the notes that we sent to designers? It has to be real.
Like, what are you doing, Rach? But you were so right, because a lot of those games haven't come out. But the inspiration, the passion that those folks that you brought on to talk about their project was really invigorating. Even at just I want to get inspired to work on my own thing kind of vibe. And I never angled for the show to be about that. And it was super cool that alphas existed to juice our listeners, to give them a little juice, a little excitement of like, you know, people are out there doing this thing, and it's pretty cool. And PbtA, you can reach a level of fluency, and you can kit bash together games and play the weird little genre that nobody else explores. You can do that thing.
And I loved seeing, again, what drove people to go, this is the genre. But also, if you look at those interviews as a whole, the trends that we're going through game design, I believe 2019 is where you start really strongly seeing belonging outside belonging show up, which is informing a couple of huge Kickstarters that have gone through the last few years.
It's true.
Wonder Home, Apocalypse Keys. Apocalypse Keys is technically PbtA, but it's got Bob all over the place on those play sheets.
Yep.
You're right in that a lot of those games never made it to fruition. I mean, the amount of games I've seen play tested at Metatopia that, or other play testing spaces that have made it through are actually quite small. But I don't think that doesn't mean there's nothing interesting to be taken away from those glimpses as to, you know, what's going on in the workshops of gaming. And talking with you, I think informed why it needed to be a different format of episode as opposed to it being a full interview episode, because to an extent, what would be the point to sit down and do a, you know, go buy this thing when it comes out? The enthusiasm would have burned out by the time it released.
Right. Which I've heard some people are starting to have that frustration with Kickstarters. Like, I was excited about this game 2 years ago when I kicked it, and now it's still not out. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the pandemic's done a dirty to all of us. But I mean, that is something I thought about with the hype in the lead up during a game's Kickstarter versus who talks about it after. And I think there's been a couple of think pieces going through the community recently.
Interesting.
Exploring those ideas. I can think of several where everyone was like really jazzed, and then the book came out, and it wasn't that the book was bad, but the enthusiasm was different at that point.
All right. Well, this is our Act Under Fire. We're each going to talk a little bit about our closing thoughts on +1 Forward. We already queued up a good number of them, but I have 2 thoughts, and then you get the last word in Act Under Fire. So first one is, I really wish I'd been able to have Sean Preston on for Tremulous. I tried like several different ways. It's back at G Plus days and Twitter and email. I tried with all the people that I knew who could do, because I don't have my degrees of
Tremulous
separation.
is an enigma.
Yeah, it never happened, and I would have liked to have had Tremulous on. It was one of those really early big swing kind of games. And I love that your partner, Rob, loves the game, man. He ran it for us.
Rob loves Tremulous so much. It is
genuinely loves
he
that
will
game.
go back to. Genuinely loves. He will admit that it does have some challenges to bring to the table, but I think my household owns all of the content, and there's quite a bit of content released for Tremulous too. That is a game that I saw talked a lot about, or I would say about 2012, 2013. And then, like, it's always been there. It just kind of leaped off. And I was curious why Tremulous was never featured, because it was such a presence early on.
I tried. I failed. Also, I had a few conversations with John Harper to have him on to talk about Ghost Lines, and it didn't ever quite work out, but we did get him on for Blades in the Dark, and I call that a win. If I had to choose, if you were like, Rich, you only get John on for one or the other, I would have chosen
You get
Blades.
one John.
You get one John appearance. That's the one that I would have chosen. So, that's a bummer bit, is I like Ghost Lines. It kind of broke my brain in some ways, and I would have loved to have had John run it for me selfishly. Like, just selfishly, I would have been cool. Other closing thought, I played a bit of a dirty trick with the Act Under Fire segment as it exists in every episode except for this one. If I'm being honest, I played a bit of a dirty trick. So my primary objective with this segment, which I feel is laudable, was to have the original designer of a game show how they imagined it would happen at the table, to allow them to demonstrate, not in theory, but in practice, the perfect moment. How the mechanics change play in an unscripted way. Now, while we say it's unscripted, you and I both, we worked very hard to try to show off the best possible aspects of every game that we got to the table. We would lunge for moves. We would angle our reactions for the juicy bits that we saw out there. It was like college kids playing Twister sometimes. We would just go for it. Red hand, blue. Let's do it.
There are parts of those segments that are cut out in editing where we said to the designer what move needs to be on screen.
Yeah.
And then we would be like, cool, challenge accepted. Let's make it happen.
Absolutely. Because we were genuinely telling and making up a whole story. We were highlighting some aspects of the game. And while we're not scripting out anything from once we engage the mechanics, Rach's shitty die rolls were Rach's shitty die rolls, friends. She just can't roll on this show.
I fudged one roll in this show. Try and find it.
She rolled so bad all the time. It was hilarious. But there was a dirty trick in there too. And that was born of a less good headspace that I was in 6 years ago. See, at the time that we started Plus One Forward, I was a little frustrated with game designers at Estrada. Not anything they did. This is all in my headspace. But at the time, I felt like game designers, at least a few of them, they like make games they didn't even play. And that annoyed me a lot because I play a lot of games. And I feel like design comes from play. And at the time, I really felt like design should only come from play, not from theory. So demos, which is Act Under Fire, that was my challenge to the people who came on the show. Put up or shut up. Not coming for the best, most wholesome place there. But you know what? On the whole, I was consistently impressed with game designers. And my little petty grievance was ground down with genuine examples of designers knowing their stuff. To be honest, the Act Under Fire segment for me was almost always the last straw before I broke down and bought a game if I didn't own it already before recording the episode. I bought easily a dozen games after playing it during Act Under Fire. I remember the Copperhead County episode where I'm in the middle of Act Under Fire and I go to his itch page and drop the dollars to get that PDF because I'm like, my God, this game has been made for me.
Did that make it into Final Cut?
I don't know. I don't know if that was Final Cut. I think I did cut it.
I remember that happening and you're like, I have the itch page open. I need this right now.
I think I cut it because it sounds just a little too fawning. But, Jason, enjoy that because it's a great game you've made. I hope that despite my dirty trick that Act Under Fire has been helpful for others, maybe not for your wallet. I've heard a few folks who found the segment valuable in the genuine way that I meant it. And apologies to everyone who's been on the show and everyone who's listened for my dirty trick.
I don't think it's that dirty of a trick at the end of the day. And I think there have been cases where people have looked at I like to imagine there's been cases where people have looked at the game and went, hey, maybe this isn't for me content-wise or whatever. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's done some good and it's made listeners realize that due to the content or the subject matter of a game, that it might not be the best game for them to be playing around with.
Yeah, maybe.
Even though it came from a more devious headspace. Another favorite part for me for Plus One Forward was, as you were sharing earlier, when creative people in our listenership mentioned that the podcast inspired them to go out and make something.
Oh, yeah.
And note, I say creative people because it's not just game designers. I don't know about you, Rich, but I'm at least an NPC in one Powered by the Apocalypse book out there. I know you've been thanked to dozens.
Yeah, it's cool.
But we have other listeners who have gone on creative pursuits inspired by the interviews, inspired by these glimpses in discussions about creativity and pulling things apart and reassembling them back together. I know one person who is podcasting in South America, inspired by our show. I've heard of people taking up writing, taking up GMing for the first time, inspired by the show. That's a creative pursuit.
Heck yes.
GMing's not creative at all. It's just very humbling to realize that you've influenced so many people to go and challenge themselves, to go and try something new, to go and make that thing they've been daydreaming for so long and make it reality.
Absolutely. Well, I guess those are our closing thoughts, right, Rach? You closed out? You got your thoughts?
I think that's it. And I hope if anyone ever goes through the back catalog of our episodes, save the ones for when my mic situation was a little bit more dire, that they're still inspired to go on and make things, be it games or otherwise.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for listening, providing feedback, retweeting when we posted up new episodes, suggesting guests or ideas to us, suggesting games that we should hunt down. It's been really gratifying to be part of the community. And also, thanks to the Gauntlet and all of the Patreons for the Gauntlet for helping to make this show a reality. Thanks to Jason Cordova for helping me to develop the show when it first launched. And he's always been a hands-off supporter. Thank you, listeners, from the bottom of my heart for being part of this journey with Rach and I. Anything you'd like to say as your parting shot, Rach? Any fires you want to burn?
Oh, I'm still shocked we ever got canceled from the internet.
We canceled ourselves first.
Ourselves. I don't think we can go out any stronger than that because we just said that at the same time. Again, thank you for everyone who has been listening and following us and for sharing your well wishes and your thoughts and things that our episodes have brought to mind on different platforms. I mean, going back to, Rich, do you remember when we had G+ and we would do Q&A episodes on our feed?
Those were so fun.
You can go find us on Mastodon.
Yep.
Who are you on Mastodon, Rich?
I'm ORKLORD at dice.camp. Where are you at, Rach?
I am TEDDog, so TEDDOG at dice.camp.
Awesome. That's where you can find us.
And our hot takes about our ongoing games and other nerdy pursuits.
Indeed. With that, we can't keep saying goodbye, so I think at this point we will officially say goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Hammer of Bill. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Hi listeners, Jason here. If you're enjoying this podcast, you should support it on Patreon. We here at The Gauntlet love making these shows, but there are a lot of costs associated with making them, and we depend on your Patreon support to cover those costs. A monthly $2 pledge doesn't seem like much, but it goes a long way towards us being able to make these podcasts. And if you pledge $6, you get early access to all the releases coming out of Gauntlet Publishing. At any given time, our Patreon feed has scenarios and playbooks for The Between, new mysteries for Brindlewood Bay, incursions for Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold, and more. $6 patrons also get early access to our big standalone game releases. We have 4 big games coming in 2023. Arkham Herald, Public Access, The Silt vs. RPG, and Moonlight Vale. And you'll get them early and at the best possible price if you make that $6 pledge. Remember, we can't do any of this without you, so head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and pledge today. Thanks.